Night had already swallowed the harbor at Nukuʻalofa when 6 restless schoolmates, Sione, Stephen, Kolo, David, Luke, and Mano, untied a 24-foot fishing boat that wasn't theirs. They were aged between 13 and 16, chafing against boarding school discipline and dreaming of Fiji, maybe even New Zealand. No one packed a compass or chart. Only bananas, coconuts, and a borrowed gas burner lay in the bilge. With a hiss of canvas, they reached for the stars, certain that the Pacific was an oversized playground and that dawn would show them a bigger, freer world. But paradise never waits for the unprepared. Before midnight, clouds piled on the moon and the wind turned feral. The improvised crew, lulled into a careless sleep, woke to walls of black water slamming the gunnels. Their first panicked act, raising the sail, became their undoing when a gust shredded it into rags. Moments later, the rudder snapped, the anchor rope parted. The boat spun helplessly while rain sheeted down, blinding and briny. In that single storm, the boys traveled from schoolyard rebels to castaways, prisoners of an ocean whose rules they had ignored. Daybreak revealed nothing but heaving gray water on every side. For 8 long days they drifted, swabbing with tin cans to keep the hull afloat, catching rain in half-shell coconuts, slicing slivers of raw fish when luck sent one flapping onto the planks. Each sip of rainwater was rationed, one mouthful at dawn, one at dusk. When despair threatened to split the group, they stifled it with prayer and a promise that no one would cry alone. Hunger gnawed, but thirst hurt worse, scorching their throats until speech became a hoarse whisper. On the 8th afternoon, a jagged silhouette rose against the slate horizon, a sheer heap of rock called Ata, abandoned by its own people a century earlier when slave raiders stole the population. To the starving boys, the cliffs looked as welcoming as a knife's edge, but the alternative was empty water. They stripped the ruined boat of 2 planks for flotation and, in darkness, slipped over the side. Waves pounded them for 36 hours as they frog-kicked toward the island. Mano's shout, "I'm ashore!" The only proof that land was real and not a fever dream. Exhaustion collapsed them on a narrow ledge where seabirds screamed overhead. The first drink they found was rain trapped inside rotten wood. The first meal was raw tern swallowed whole. They dug a shallow cave with bare hands, slept in a tangle of limbs and nightmares, and woke to the decision that panic had to die if they were to live. Already the seeds of their tiny society were germinating. They would govern themselves by cooperation or not at all. 3 months in, thirst drove them higher. They scaled the near-vertical walls into the volcanic crater and stumbled upon the overgrown ruins of Kolo, a 19th century village reclaimed by jungle. Among toppled terraces, they found wild bananas, taro, and the descendants of the villagers' chickens, as feral as they were fat. Garden beds were cleared, rainwater cisterns hollowed from tree trunks, and a permanent cooking hearth established on a sheltered shelf. To keep order, they paired off into rotating teams. 2 for gardens, 2 for kitchen and fishing duty, 2 to patrol cliffs for sail smoke that never came. Dawn began with a hymn they all knew. Dusk ended with the same harmony and a whispered inventory of blessings. Kolo, the group's quiet tinkerer, carved a guitar from driftwood, a coconut shell, and 6 strands of salvaged wire. At night, the crater filled with music that skipped across the Pacific like sparks, 5 original songs composed to remind them of home. Their fire, coaxed from 2 sticks and a stubborn hope, was guarded as fiercely as any treasure. One boy always remained beside the embers, feeding palm fronds and watching for the tiniest glow, because losing that flame meant returning to stone-cold fish and bitter nights. In William Golding's fiction, boys fight over fire. On Ata, they nurtured it, proof that civilization can be contained in a single coal. Hardship still hunted them. Rain failed for weeks, leaving only bird blood to quench thirst. Stephen slipped on a wet cliff and shattered his leg. The others carried him up switchbacks cut into basalt, fashioned splints from branches and vines, set the limb, and for weeks shouldered his chores without complaint. When he returned to full strength, the bone had knitted so perfectly that the doctor who later examined him could scarcely believe it had been broken. Loneliness was beaten back with ritual. Each Sunday, they built a pulpit of stones and held service, giving thanks for the week survived. They celebrated birthdays with extra bananas, settled arguments by enforced silence, timeouts that sent the offender to opposite cliffs until tempers cooled, and recorded their days by scoring notches into driftwood poles. Against the stereotype of adolescent savagery, they proved that maturity is less about age than about the courage to care for others. Once they dared to dream of escape, lashing logs into a raft. The Pacific laughed. A mile offshore, the swell smashed their handiwork, and they limped back to shore, chastened but alive. Fate, it turned out, had spared them. They had been sailing south, deeper into empty ocean, convinced Samoa lay that way. Sometimes failure is a quiet guardian. 15 months slipped past. Hair grew to their shoulders, skin leathered, muscles thickened from climbing and hauling water. From offshore, the boys' handmade civilization announced itself only by strange rectangles of scorched grass where they lit signal fires. One such blackened patch caught the eye of Peter Warner, skipper of the Tasmanian lobster boat Just David, on Sunday the 11th of September 1966. Warner, curious about the cursed Isle of Ata, peered through binoculars and saw bodies hurling from a cliff like spirits. Long hair, bare skin. He kept his ladder raised until one swimmer reached the hull, clung to the rail and said, "My name is Stephen. There are 6 of us. We've been here 15 months. Skepticism ruled until Warner radioed the boys' names to Nukuʻalofa. 20 minutes later, the operator wept. These children had funerals, not futures. Just David lowered its ladder. 6 lean, sun-browned castaways climbed aboard, leaving a faithful plume of smoke curling behind them. When the boat docked in Tonga, jubilation collided with bureaucracy. Police arrested the teenagers. The owner of the stolen vessel demanded justice. Warner struck a deal. Channel 7 in Sydney would buy film rights for £150, the sum needed to placate the furious fishermen. Charges dropped. The boys walked free into the arms of families who had already buried them in memory. Gratitude blossomed into opportunity. King Taufa Ahau Tupu IV granted Warner a concession to trap spiny lobster, and the captain hired his 6 new friends as crew, giving them the voyage they had once tried to steal. Where they had drifted helplessly, they now stood watch on a sturdy deck, drawing pay and purpose from the same ocean that nearly killed them. Back on Ata, the signal fire died, but the legacy it lit still flickers. Scholars cite the episode as a living rebuttal to Golding's bleak imagination. Left alone, these teenagers did not regress to savagery. They sang, they gardened, they healed. They invented systems that kept quarrels small and spirits high. Cooperation, they proved, is not a fragile veneer, but a renewable resource. Half a century later, Mano, now a silver-haired grandfather, still laughs about squeezing rain from rotten wood, the sweetest drop in the world, and how music echoed in the crater like church bells. The island taught him, he says, that survival is a choice repeated every dawn. Stand together or fall alone. Peter Warner kept Kolo's driftwood guitar for decades, a relic lighter than balsa yet heavy with meaning. In interviews before his death in 2021, he would stroke the coconut shell soundbox and marvel that 6 boys had tuned disaster to the key of endurance. Ata remains uninhabited, battered by wind and legend. Somewhere in its crater, banana trees tangle with taro, chickens scratch volcanic earth, and stone terraces remember the mornings when 6 teenagers voted to be better than circumstance. Their story is sung in Tongan schools, whispered by sailors passing at night, and preserved in archives under one incredulous headline: "This is a miracle." The miracle was not that they were found. It was that long before rescue they had already saved themselves, refusing to let fear divide them, turning mischief into governance, lighting a fire, and guarding it together. In a century crowded with cautionary tales about human darkness, the boys of Ata stand like a bright flame on a lonely cliff, reminding us that the heart's natural compass points toward each other. So when next you hear Lord of the Flies invoked as proof that chaos is our default, remember the real chapter written in saltwater and song. 6 teenagers set sail as truants and returned as a choir, their shared refrain etched into every log they cut and every note they sang: "We keep the fire alive." The ember still glows, waiting for anyone who believes humanity can do the same.